to face the reality and acknowledge even a little bit of what's going on?
Yeah, well, it's a very good question, because that is the difficulty for anyone who wants to engage with the government on whatever level. A blanket denial that these violations are happening is technically not an avenue that's open to the government legally, because under international law, as it relates to torture and as it relates to extrajudicial executions or state killings, if there is one allegation of either of those violations happening, then the Ethiopian government has a legal obligation to conduct investigations. So that just refusal, that, you know, the response that these things do not happen is not a legitimate response in that framework. They have to conduct investigations into allegations of torture, into allegations of state killings, and we hope that the international community will try and encourage, if not put pressure on them to make that happen. But you're right that if you have a starting point of admitting that there might be a problem, or that there, even if it comes from a lack of capacity, institutional weakness, things that need to be built up, that's a starting point that you can engage with from whichever perspective you're coming. If it's technical assistance, you know, funding to address the violation, you know, to address weaknesses or the problems in systems wherever they exist, which is what donors could do and I believe want to do. You don't have that starting point when there's a blanket denial. So you're right, it's incredibly problematic. I think that, you know, that's the public face of the government's response, is that these things just don't happen. I hope that behind closed doors there's perhaps a more realistic response and acknowledgement of what's going on, and then perhaps there can be some very small steps even within the government to start to address those issues.
Ethiopia is heading to an election in 2015. You know, the arrest, the imprisonment of Bakala Garba and Orbana Lelisa is related to election issues, and also meeting with you and your team. Is that right? So what's your projection in terms of, like, you know, the intensity of human rights abuse ahead, you know, during the elections in Oromia region? And other regions as well. Do you have anything to say about that?
Well, I think in general the space for political freedoms, the exercise of political rights has continued to shrink ever since 2005 elections. I think though we can also already see certain things happening which are the lead up to the next elections. As you will know, after the master plan protests in Oromia in April and May this year, there were thousands of people arrested in the initial period, but those elections continued, and even just a few weeks ago we were receiving more information about further arrests of members of the Oromo Federalist Congress Party and further arrests of students across Oromia, as well as other political parties as well. There's starting to be some reports about other arrests happening, and I think that, you know, we can see that's the beginning of the lead up to the next elections. So I certainly think that there's a very big risk that violations will increase ahead of the elections in terms of targeting of opposition parties, targeting of any protesters, if any protests should happen, further arrests and other violations.
Okay. So, in terms of Amnesty International's presence in Ethiopia, what's the next step for Amnesty International? Is there anything that you think is going to happen? Are you going to be granted access, or?
I think at the moment it's very unlikely that we'll be granted access anytime soon. We have, you know, we are the target of significant hostility from the government, and there's not an interest or a point where we can engage for dialogue. We will continue to attempt that. We have sent copies of the report to a number of ministries in the government, the regional government, the Office of the Prime Minister, and continue to request dialogue to discuss the findings within that. But I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon. But I hope that other entities might be let in. As you said, the response of the government to this report is that this doesn't happen and everything is fine. And one way of them proving or demonstrating that everything is fine would be to give access to entities like, for example, the human rights mechanisms from the UN, Special Rapporteur on Torture, for example, or giving proper access to detention centres for independent monitors, because at the moment there's no one who actually documents human rights violations, publicly documents them, has access to detention centres in Ethiopia. So if everything is fine, then that can be demonstrated if independent observers and independent monitors had access to do that. So I hope that the government can be encouraged to let in some of those independent mechanisms who can conduct impartial investigations.
So do you have any messages that you would like to send to the Oromo community and people in the Horn of Africa in terms of the work that you and Amnesty International do? I know that the report Because I'm Oromo has inspired a lot of people who have felt for a long time that their stories are not being told, despite rampant, as you said in the report, sweeping rights abuses in Oromia and elsewhere. Do you have any message for the members of the Oromo community in the US and in Oromia and around the world?
Well, I think that everyone can be part of beginning to address the problem in different stages of it. It's so essential, particularly where human rights civil society in Ethiopia has been destroyed. It's so essential for information to come out, good quality, reliable human rights related information. And it is a risk for people to be involved in sending information, passing on information. But where possible, then that should be an increase of information coming out can only be a good thing. And then for the community outside of Ethiopia, everyone can be a human rights activist in however whatever capacity is available to you, including the Oromo community here in the US. Everyone will have a congressperson, and you can write to your congressperson, or you can request a meeting with your congressperson, and if enough people do it in the community or in that person's district, it becomes an issue that they have to respond to, because they have an electoral interest in responding to issues that are raised by their constituents in their district, or their constituents if they're MPs in the UK, for example. And then that person will then take it forward within the US government, including in relation to those issues that I raised earlier about looking at scrutiny of where money is going, who's being funded, what is being funded, and that kind of thing. So I think there's always some action that you can take constructively, and I know, as you say, this report has caused a lot of reaction. It's caused some people to be inspired and increase of anger, but channel all of that energy into something constructive, and it is possible. Every person can do that and can find a way of trying to use that energy to make a change.
Thank you very much, Claire Beston. Claire Beston is in Washington, D.C. to speak at the event organized by the Oromo Community Center in Northwest Washington, D.C. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks.